Hi, I'm Marc, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views report on the politics of the European Union. The International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, has fired its General Secretary Luca Visentini because of the corruption scandal in the European Parliament. The executive board had lost confidence in the Italian, as the ITUC announced on Sunday in Brussels. Visentini was arrested by the Belgian judiciary in mid-December, along with 5 other suspects. After questioning, he was released. Several other suspects were taken into custody, including Eva Kaili, vice president of the European Parliament at the time, who has since been replaced. The Greek is still in prison. The scandal is about alleged influence on decisions of the EU Parliament by Qatar and Morocco. The Public Prosecutor's Office has accused the accused of corruption, money laundering, and membership in a criminal organization. Visentini is accused of accepting money from an NGO, but he denies the allegations. The statement said no evidence had been found that donations from Qatar or Morocco had influenced ITUC policy or program. At the beginning of May, a new General Secretary should be elected, who should then prepare an extraordinary Congress. The ITUC is an international umbrella organization of trade unions. On Tuesday, the EU Commission presented its proposal for reform of the European electricity market, which is primarily intended to relieve the burden on consumers. Last year, skyrocketing gas prices as a result of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine drove up electricity prices. The reason for this is that the electricity price has so far also been dependent on the gas price. According to a draft that has already been made public, no major reform of the electricity market is planned. Among other things, consumers and companies should therefore benefit more from long-term contracts and thus from more stable prices. With the reform of the electricity market, the EU Commission wants to avoid skyrocketing prices for consumers and promote the expansion of renewable energies. Above all, as I said, long-term contracts for electricity generation from renewable energies and nuclear power are to be promoted, according to the proposal by the authority presented in Strasbourg on Tuesday. Renewable energies are the ticket to energy sovereignty, said Commission Vice President Frans Timmermans. We need to update our market design to ensure that this transition happens as quickly as possible and that consumers can benefit from the lower costs of renewable energy. In order to protect end customers from strong price fluctuations, the authority proposes a right to fixed price contracts and contracts with dynamic pricing. For example, consumers could choose both secure long-term pricing and dynamic pricing contracts with suppliers if they want to take advantage of price volatility. With the help of natural CO2 stores such as soil and forests, at least 310 million tons of CO2 equivalent are to be bound in the EU by 2030. The EU Parliament voted 479 yes to 97 no votes, with 43 abstentions on Tuesday for specific goals of individual EU states. According to an earlier communication by the EU Parliament, Germany would have to shoulder around 10% of the total reduction. Since the influence of individual greenhouse gases such as methane or CO2 on the climate varies, the CO2 equivalent is used as a comparison value. The EU states have agreed on a general position on the reform of European debt rules as well, but still see many unanswered questions. We have found agreement in some areas, said Federal Finance Minister Christian Lindner on Tuesday in Brussels. However, other fields have also been identified where further work is necessary, because the perspectives differ, because the perspectives are sometimes very controversial. Lindner therefore called the joint conclusions of the finance ministers an invention. Under his pressure, the demand that the EU Commission exchange information closely with the EU states before presenting its legislative proposal for the reform of the so-called Stability and Growth Pact was added to the text. This should happen in the coming weeks. According to the EU member states, the negotiations should be completed by the end of the year. Lindner had recently been particularly annoyed that the EU Commission was already referring to the ongoing debate on the Stability and Growth Pact in its guidelines for budget and debt policy 2024 presented last week. In order to increase the number of deportations of rejected asylum seekers, the EU member states should mutually recognize corresponding decisions according to the will of the European Commission. Today, migrants with a negative asylum decision could simply move to another EU country and start the process there again, as EU Interior Commissioner Ylva Johansson said in Strasbourg on Tuesday. Obviously, this is a real abuse of the system. That's why we want to close these loopholes. In concrete terms, the EU Commission is relying on the member states being informed about return notifications from other EU countries thanks to the updated Schengen information system that was recently put into operation. This enables the mutual recognition of decisions and their rapid implementation. According to the will of the EU Parliament, data from modern cars, networked household appliances, or industrial systems, such as wind turbines, for example, should be used better in the future. MEPs approved a corresponding law on Tuesday, which should also bring about lower prices for services and repairs of network devices. In the field of artificial intelligence in particular, large amounts of data are required to train algorithms. The project still has to be discussed with the EU member states before it can come into force. The basis is a proposal that the EU Commission presented in February last year, and which is intended to regulate fair access to data generated when using network devices. According to the Brussels authorities, 80% of industrial data in the EU has so far remained unused. In the transition to a climate-friendly industry, the EU Commission wants to relieve certain sectors with less bureaucracy and make Europe less dependent on important raw materials exporters such as China. To this end, the Brussels Authority presented two legislative proposals on Thursday. The so-called European Law on Critical Raw Materials is intended, among other things, to set specifications for production targets. According to a draft, at least 10% of the annual consumption of certain ores and minerals in the EU should be mined. So far, the EU has been dependent on third countries for important raw materials. We get 98% of our rare earths and 93% of our magnesium from China, reported EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently. According to the will of the EU member states, large industrial and agricultural companies should in future emit fewer pollutants into the air, water and wastewater. The responsible ministers agreed on Thursday on their negotiating position for new regulations for industry and companies with intensive livestock farming. The new rules would support the EU goals on climate, pollution prevention and the circular economy and energy policy by helping to transform their industries. That's what Swedish Environment Minister Romina Pourmokhtari said in Brussels. They should also apply to mining. The regulations on industrial emissions are said to be the main EU instrument to regulate industrial and agricultural pollution, such as nitrogen oxide, ammonia, mercury, methane, and carbon dioxide. And this concludes this week's video on the politics of the European Union. The next one is right here in the end screen. I'll be back.